Meanwhile, the killing goes on as both sides prepare for a fresh onslaught. It's been a bad week here in Vietnam.
Vietnam 1967. Enter 26-year-old Melbourne nurse Dot Angel. She'd signed up for a civilian medical team sent by Australia to help the locals.
And when they called for volunteers, I thought, this is it, off I go on another adventure. And so I volunteered, not knowing anything about what we were going to be facing.
When they first arrived, most of the medical staff of those hospitals had been recruited into the Vietnamese army. So basically the medical system in Vietnam had broken down. I mean, they went into hospitals where there'd been no care and attention for months on end.
The Australians worked in the shadow of a vast US airbase.
This was Bien Hoa Air Base outside Saigon and home of the 173rd Airborne Brigade.
But the might of US logistics didn't stretch to Bien Hoa Hospital or the civilians being treated there.
The nurses were sent armed with only nylon uniforms, duty shoes and notes on how to dress for embassy functions.
I think we thought that we were going to another Alfred Hospital with all the facilities, all the equipment, etc., etc. And what we found were the hospital conditions in the rural area. So we had wards that had dirt floors.
This was an official mission, but the team was undersupplied.
We were short of everything. The team before us was sharpening used needles. The first weekend I was there, I had 30 patients. And so they were on stretchers on the floor. They were, if they were children, you might have 3 children lying sideways on a bed. We were there to treat any Vietnamese personnel who came through the gates of the hospital. It didn't matter what side they were on. And so what we were confronted with, yes, was war trauma, but also we were confronted with medical conditions which we had never seen in Australia. For instance, thyroid glands that were like huge collars.
In a pervasive war, Bien Hoa Hospital was effectively on the front line.
From the point of view of children, there's one who sticks out, he was a 12-year-old and he'd stepped on a Claymore mine and he was peppered right throughout. Unfortunately, he subsequently died. Other children had lost limbs, they were burnt with napalm. Others, it was the malnutrition. They came in and they were starving.
Even for medical staff from an Australian hospital, this was confronting.
Well, it's just like a casualty department. Most of the injuries are accidental, whereas in wartime, the injuries are deliberately man-made. And that was the most difficult.
After her 4-month tour, the transition back home was overwhelming.
Just like the returned Australian soldiers, many of the doctors and nurses felt that they had abandoned the people of South Vietnam.
When I looked out at the plane and everybody was out yachting, and I thought to myself, oh yes, well, yachting, barbecues, etc., you have no idea what's going on. And I think that went on for years, and I think this is also the sort of thing that the military fellows had to face as well.
The war ended, but back home the trauma grew for many of the 450 members of the civilian medical teams.
Found myself with any loud noise, cowering. I found myself going into rage, and I spent quite a number of years trying to get help.
A soldier must learn many things. One of the hardest is to make a shattered body work again.
While service personnel could access greater medical benefits through a Veterans Gold Card, Dot and her civilian colleagues weren't eligible.
The Department of Veterans Affairs applied the rule that you had to be deployed as part of the Defence Forces, and therefore you had to have what they called qualifying service. They didn't apply the same set of rules to the civilians.
Outraged Vietnam veterans swung in behind them.
Well, it's our opinion that they probably saw some of the hardest times that perhaps a lot of the Australian servicemen didn't see.
I think the turning point for the civilian surgical teams was the love and the recognition from the military personnel that we've bonded to.
It took decades, but the civilian surgical teams were given Veterans Gold Cards in 2020.
Everybody plays the most important role. It doesn't matter what their particular task is.
And since the 1980s, Dot and her colleagues proudly march alongside the war's other veterans.
I was overwhelmed, actually. And I think the people who were lining the street, it was a massive surprise at the welcome that we got. And I think from the point of view of the civilian surgical teams was that we were finally being recognised.
50 years since the last Australian military and civilian workers left Vietnam, this week Dot will head to Canberra for a crucial memorial service.
I think it's terribly important, actually, from that point of view, and I think it's probably a great ending for the families that no longer have their veteran still with them. I think it will help the families as well.